I like to joke, or I used to joke, that it was alcohol. However, I am in recovery right now, so it's not booze anymore. But I think for me, it's the drive to connect with people, and it's also very therapeutic for me. And I'm sure that's a pretty common answer for a lot of people. But the act of creation and breathing life into something, even if it's a two-dimensional drawing, there's something that's, I don't know, rejuvenating about that. There's something that's exciting about it, and it adds something to my life that not necessarily is lacking. But if I wasn't drawing or writing, I know I would be in some deep depression, because it's just something I'm driven to do, something I'm compelled to do, is create. And I feel like a lot of artists, a lot of, not just comic book artists, but musicians, actors, all across the entertainment spectrum, that's one of the driving forces, is just this, I don't know, this mechanism inside of you that you have to do it. And there are certainly days when I don't feel, up to the challenge or up to the task. But that's the main thing for me, is telling stories and sharing stories with people, and just having to expel them from inside of you. It's, almost a exorcism of sorts, I suppose, which maybe sounds really odd, but that's, in a way, that's how it feels.
Let's talk nerdy things, like comic books and superheroes, with some nerdy peeps, writers, cartoonists, and so much more. So stick around and have some fun with the lovely and adorable Eva Webb.
Hello, my love puppies. Welcome to Titular Characters. I am your adorable host, Eva Webb, and in this issue, we're featuring author and illustrator Alex Schumacher, whose work includes the Unemployment Adventures of Aqualung graphic novel for Arcana Studios, the world's crummiest umbrella picture book for Wandering Words Press, articles for Comic-Con, and storyboards for DreamWorks TV. His first collection of literary magazine comics, Defiling the Literati, was released in 2017 to rave reviews from such sites as Graphic Policy and Bleeding Cool. Alex produced the weekly webcomic Decades of Inexperience for Antix Press between 2015 and 2021, and he continues the monthly misadventures of Mr. BUTTERCHIPS for Drunk Monkeys. A collection of the latter was released by SLG Publishing in July of 2020. But the best part is that he's here, and we're going to get to talk to him. How are you, Alex?
I'm doing fairly well, thank you. How are you?
I'm loving life. Yeah, I mean, it's just fun. Anyway, so I guess the starting point, the better one, is where are you from? Where does your journey begin?
Oh, wow. Well, originally I was born in Santa Monica. I've lived in California my entire life, so started down there. My folks split when I was about 5. We moved up to a place called Salinas, which is close to Monterey. I spent my formative years there, and then I've been up in the Bay Area on and off since I was about 22.
How did you discover comics?
From a very early age, honestly, almost, the earliest memory I have is of reading comics. My grandparents gifted me with this incredibly weighty tome called the Smithsonian Collection of Newspaper Comic Strips. And it was filled to the brim with every comic you can think of, from the beginning with the Yellow Kid, and I think the collection actually ends somewhere in the 80s, so it's things like the Peanuts Gang and Hagar the Horrible. But through that book, I discovered artists like Walt Kelly, who did Pogo, just this beautiful brushwork, very almost Disney-esque looking. One of my favorites named Roy Crane, who did a comic called Captain Easy. And so from that moment, I kind of aspired to be a syndicated cartoonist, which didn't quite work out, and we could talk about that as well. But then I discovered comics probably when I was 7 or 8 with an early issue of Batman. Actually, my aunt gave me this large, literally a garbage bag full of old floppies that she had collected from the 60s and 70s when she was a child. And one of them, which still, is very vividly called to mind, is an issue of Batman that plays on the Paul is Dead hoax with the Beatles. And I remember that cover striking me. And from that point forward, I had always loved comics. And though I kind of veered away from superhero books and found more of an interest in the independent books, that's really where that love kind of synthesized and really took hold.
So how does one go about trying to be a syndicated cartoonist?
Well, first you have to be borderline legally insane. But when I was starting out, the newspaper circulation was already kind of in decline. So it was kind of a poor time to really try and start your career in that specific milieu of comics. So I tried to be a syndicated comic strip artist, cartoonist, from the time I was, I think, about 25 until I was 28 or so. Found mostly rejection and heartache, but was also honing my craft at the time. So there was some very valuable experience that I found during those years too. And then I found comic books and sort of indie comics, and discovered publishers like Fantagraphics and Tron and Quarterly and Slice of Life comics, and kind of started veering off in a different direction at that point. But when I was trying to do the comic strip work, that was something that very quickly became evident to me that it was kind of like going down with a sinking ship. And they've sort of found their footing a little bit now online, which was really, that was kind of the turning point between print circulation and digital, the digital medium. So they hadn't quite figured out their place in that world yet. But yeah, I started doing comics after that, and haven't looked back since.
It's interesting because the current comic is called Mr. BUTTERCHIPS.
Yeah,
it's a collection of political commentary with a very, very cynical monkey as the main character. The first thing I just sort of flipped to a random page, and the first thing I see is this screed on gay frogs. That was just brilliant.
Right. Yeah. The play on the classic Alex Jones rant about the water turning the frogs gay and whatever, ridiculousness he was spewing. And that was actually done for Gay Pride. So it was sort of twofold, in my opinion. I was making fun of an idiotic right-wing commentator and also celebrating Gay Pride. So why not? So that was, it's been important to me to not only, satirize, because the last 4 years have almost buried satire, but it's also important to keep the humor in there, I think, and make it very evident that while I am discussing very serious topics, there is room to also, laugh at some of the lunacy that surrounds that.
So there's a couple of challenges you're going to face with a book like this, though. The first is just sort of fatigue, and I realize that not everybody experiences this, but sort of as a member of the queer community, the last 4 years have just been hell for all of us. And I feel like, we live in this world where you can't tell the difference anymore between an Onion headline and the real thing, and it's kind of just hard to laugh.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that may serve me a little bit better now because that administration is no longer in power. But at the same time, that kind of intolerance and hatred was around, unfortunately, long before Trump and will last long after. And, for me, I'm I'm a Jewish guy who, not necessarily in the same, I don't know, sort of vulnerability or same sort of vulnerable state as the LGBTQ community or the Black community or some other sort of far more visible group like that. But certainly anti-Semitism, skyrocketed while that administration was in power too. So that was something that I felt very strongly that I had to push back against as well, and not just for my queer friends or my the people of color who are friends of mine. It was for myself as well.
I completely 100% understand that one. I'm also Jewish. It's hard. We live in a time where, you go to synagogue and you have to worry about, getting gunned down by a white nationalist.
Sure.
Yeah. You never know. I mean, this has happened. Nobody ever expected it.
Yeah. No, it definitely has. And that's, for me, presenting those viewpoints and some of my own insecurities and, my angry reactions to things there's been something about using a cartoon monkey as a vessel for that, as opposed to drawing diary comics, because it seems to be a little bit more palatable, or maybe people are a little bit more willing to listen when it's this, alcoholic, cartoon monkey who's pickling his liver while also pushing back against, the patriarchy and intolerance and anti-Semitism and all of these other things. Whereas if it was just a comic version of myself doing that, I'm not sure it would have been received in quite the same way. And there are also some more surrealistic elements that wouldn't have worked quite as well either if it was more of a slice of life comic.
I like the structure of it. How the comics themselves are built. You start off at the first panel in the page, and then you get to the end of the thought by the last panel, and it's sort of a 9-panel grid. And that's your punchline. It really feels like a syndicated strip.
Yeah, definitely, and very influenced by not just the comic strips that I read as a kid, but also the underground comics of the 60s and 70s, which I became kind of fascinated with in my later 20s. And so that's actually the genesis of the character, was more of an homage to those comics, Robert Crumb and one of my favorites, Gilbert Shelton, who does the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, and Spain Rodriguez, and all of these great, iconoclast comics. So it premiered in April of 2016 in the Drunk Monkeys magazine, which is the magazine that's run it all this time. But of course, that pastiche lasted for, all of 5 or 6 months until the November election happened. And then, pivoted pretty sharply into political commentary. But it definitely, its footing, its, foundation is from the syndicated comics and the underground comics. So that observation of yours is really astute.
I was going to mention the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. It's definitely got that kind of vibe to it. How would you describe what an underground comic is, or what it looks like?
The original movement was a little before my time, but the idea behind them is to the freedom, I think, is pushing back against things like the what was it called, the comic book code and censorship, and providing a running commentary not just on life, but something that can be relatable and can give people something to I don't know, maybe an escape that superheroes don't necessarily give, something that has a bit more gravity, that talks about issues that people are actually experiencing. And that carried through really into the 80s, I think, and then it sort of petered out a little bit. But like you said, I think with webcomics, I think with the advent of webcomics, there was this resurgence and renaissance of people being able to do that with the liberation to kind of say whatever they wanted without fear of some editor or a CEO, probably not the editor, but someone higher up in a company saying, well, we can't say this because this statement or this message isn't on brand or won't sell, won't make us money. Capitalism was kind of in stark contrast to the to the tone and the idea behind the undergrounds. So it was started very much, as something to stand against, corporate America and just corporate comics, I guess, corporate entertainment.
Is that why the Mr. Butterchips book is in black and white?
Yeah, that was. I mean, part of that was because of my dearth of ability to color comics well, and the other inspiration behind that was my love for the cross hatching and the line work that went into the older comic strips, and I wanted that to be a bit more of a prominent feature than coloring. The artwork can be a little bit more open when you have coloring because that can compensate for a lot or can accentuate line work in a way that black and white you're just relying on the art itself. And so that was sort of an exercise for me in seeing how much of my influence I can replicate, and considering the fact that I'm constantly disappointing myself, who knows how well I actually did, but that was certainly the impetus behind doing the black and white.
Where does your creativity come from? Where is your zen?
I like to joke, or I used to joke, that it was alcohol. However, I am in recovery right now, so it's not booze anymore. But I think for me, it's the drive to connect with people. And it's also very therapeutic for me. And I'm sure that's a pretty common answer for a lot of people. But the act of creation and breathing life into something, even if it's, a two-dimensional drawing, there's something that's, I don't know, rejuvenating about that. There's something that's exciting about it. And it adds something to my life that, not necessarily is lacking, but if I wasn't drawing or writing, I know I would be in some deep depression because it's just something I'm driven to do, something I'm compelled to do is create. And I feel like a lot of artists, a lot of not just comic book artists, but, musicians, actors, all across the entertainment spectrum, that's one of the driving forces is just this, this mechanism inside of you that you have to do it. And there are certainly days when I don't feel, up to the challenge or up to the task. But that's the main thing for me is telling stories and sharing stories with people and just having to expel them from inside of you. It's, almost a exorcism of sorts, I suppose, which maybe sounds really odd, but that's, in a way, that's how it feels.
So how do you stay topical on the one hand and keep it fresh on the other without repeating yourself too much?
Yeah, that's a challenge specific to the Mr. Butterchips comic because I've done other, graphic novels and other web comics and things that didn't necessarily rely on, the news of the day or topical information. So with Mr. Butterchips specifically, at least for the last 4 years, it has been a challenge, but the way that's been dealt with on my end is it was published as a monthly. So especially with the last year or two, there was an abundance of information and it was more about whittling it down or distilling that month down to the most important kind of story in my mind, or the most important, issue to touch on. But the Mr. Butterchips comic initially, like I said, was, designed as an homage to underground comics, and was manufactured to be able to continue in perpetuity in a lot of ways. And right now, I think, especially with the book out, it's sort of seen as specifically, socio-political commentary. But hopefully over the next couple of years, I'm going to shift that focus a little bit. And which is also why in the book I included a separate 22-page standalone story, which was essentially just an acid trip through San Francisco, because I wanted to allow people to see that other side of what Mr. Butterchips was kind of supposed to be, and still can be, but it was definitely diverted for a little while because of all the shenanigans and treachery and villainy that were besetting us every single friggin' day.
What was the first comic book you published?
Oh boy! So the very first one I published was self-published with a good friend of mine, and it was called The Wicked, and it was both of our first forays into comic books. So to say that it was not exemplary would be an understatement, but it was our first book, and everybody has to get their feet wet somehow, and that was kind of how we did it. So I think we only put out 2 issues, but it was a vampire story long before the vampire sort of trope had come about even, which was interesting. And it also dealt very much with religion and how sort of the occult and religious fanaticism can clash and also intertwine. So it was definitely an interesting concept. I just think between the two of us being pretty green at the time, the execution wasn't exactly great. But again, it was something that we then both had first portfolio piece, and something that we can say that we worked on and that we had under our belts. And that was one of the most important things with that book. And that certainly led to other jobs from independent companies after that. And just, I was sort of building momentum from there. So I'm certainly not going to, lament doing it, because everybody has a first book. And I don't think nobody that I know is exactly fond of that first book. I don't know many people that are, or maybe not even your first book, but your first, serious professional work. But everybody has to start somewhere, and that's where we started. I still have a couple copies somewhere, probably at the back of an attic or something.
You also worked on a picture book called The World's Crummiest Umbrella.
Yeah.
And it looks really interesting. How did that project come to be?
I've always loved children's books, picture books, and was influenced by people like Maurice Sendak and Shel Silverstein, and a lot of those people whose books were pretty prominent when I was a kid. So one of my objectives, one of my goals in this wild ride of trying to be a cartoonist and writer was to publish children's books as well. And also, despite the anti-Semitism that I discovered years later, I actually really enjoyed Roald Dahl's books when I was a kid too, and the illustrations of Quentin Blake. So this was The World's Crummiest Umbrella was the first time that I took that goal seriously. And I queried a bunch of literary agents, but I was not adept at the art of the query letter at that time. So I didn't have anybody pick me up. But I did find a vanity press based out of Nashville, so nowhere near me in California. But it was a woman named Jennifer Chesick, who runs Wandering in the Words Press. And she ended up digging it, so she published it. And it wasn't a runaway success. Not that I expected it to be, being from a vanity press, but it was a great experience. And as far as I'm concerned, it was still fulfilling sort of a lifelong dream to put that out into the world. And the people that have found it seem to have really enjoyed it. So that's been one of the remarkable things for me. It was 2014, and it was one of the first times that I started receiving messages from strangers, not just your mom telling you that your work is wonderful, or a good friend giving you that pat on the back, but from people I had never met before telling me how much they enjoyed my work, which was just a magnificent feeling that's hard to replicate in a lot of ways. But that was the book that did it. But I'm all about, the format fitting the story too. While I love comics, I hope to do, several different formats of books. If I can continue doing this long enough, I'd love to do another picture book. I'd love to write a prose book. I absolutely want to do more comics, and I did subsequently end up signing with a literary agent for my graphic novel work, and so we're pitching one right now, and hopefully that will be successful too. So for me, it's about not hindering the story by trying to, put a square peg in a round hole. It's more about honoring that story that you're trying to tell in the format that it deserves. And The World's Crummiest Umbrella for me was a picture book, without a doubt.
So how did you get involved with DreamWorks TV?
Oh, yeah. So one of my detours from comics was trying to get into the animation industry. So I don't have any formal education in anything, let alone animation or art. But over the years, going to conventions and then, finding a home online and networking those ways, I was connected with a talent manager based in LA. And we worked together for several years on some animation pitches. So none of them ended up going anywhere, unfortunately. It's an incredibly difficult industry to not only try and get a foothold in as, a storyboard artist or a background painter, but increasingly difficult as a series creator, which is what we were trying to do, is pitch actual series. So through that, the talent manager then was saying, his goal was to try to get me some experience in the industry, because you kind of work your way up. A lot of people who have really well-known series are people who started on a lot of other series as, again, as part of the staff. So there was one of his clients who sold a show to DreamWorks TV, which was called, let's see if I could get this correct. It was Astrid Strudelman, the Unicorn Whisperer, I believe. So he hooked me up with her, and I was able to do storyboards for a couple of episodes there. And again, it was just mainly meant to be a good portfolio piece, which it was, because then I got tests for, Ben 10 and a few other shows, which, ultimately I didn't end up getting, but never even would have been seen if it weren't for those storyboards that were initially completed.
Is storyboarding dramatically different than doing comic art?
No. Yes and no. As far as it's all sequential storytelling, right? So it's all very similar. But with storyboards, you essentially create a comic, and then these days you have to use some sort of program or another to create animatics, which is essentially, making the storyboard panels move as though it was the animated story. So there's a few differences like that, but in a lot of ways, yes, they're very similar. And I think people have even commented on the fact that, storyboards for movies like The Matrix or anything like that are essentially just comic books that are adapted. So there are absolutely a lot of similarities between those two, for sure.
Do you, when you draw comics, are there any challenges that you feel like you face creatively, just going from like 0 to 1,000 miles an hour doing it?
Oh yeah, constantly. I think like any other illustrator, I think like I kind of joked earlier, I'm constantly disappointing myself. You see what you want to draw in your head, and while I feel as though a lot of people can translate that pretty much effortlessly, which I'm sure isn't the case, for me, it's such a grueling undertaking to try and get it specifically as I see it in my head. And I sort of jokingly, half jokingly refer to myself as a writer who can draw. And I don't do that, to sound pretentious. I say that because I feel as though my writing is a little bit stronger than my artwork. And that said, I love drawing. So, if I do in the future find, an illustrator to work on a book with, I'd be more than open to that. But there's something about translating my own stories into the artwork that's incredibly satisfying. So it's something that I'm definitely going to be doing, indefinitely for the time being. But I have no objections to working with other illustrators at some point either. So I think the main difficulties for me are getting the pages to a point where I am okay with other people seeing them. We're getting it to a point where it actually looks like something that is of a vaguely professional quality in my own mind.
Yeah, I completely understand how that one goes. It's easy to be your own harshest critic.
Oh, of course. Yeah, and everybody is, and I understand that. But it's something that we all, as artists, I think, struggle with. So for me, that's the main thing. Because telling a story, writing a story, I feel as though that comes somewhat more naturally to me. And again, maybe it comes down to the fact that I don't have any training, so I'm always learning in a way. But that's been the biggest, I think, hurdle for me, is continually progressing with my artwork.
One thing I've noticed is that if you follow an artist for any given length of time, it's always fun to watch them start at the beginning and then sort of grow as an artist as they move forward.
Sure.
Do you feel like there are milestones there where you could say, okay, well, at this point I was this, and then all of a sudden I was this, or how does that evolution work?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when you're publishing books, that kind of metric can be a little bit more difficult to actually see. But with webcomics, so like with Mr. Butterchips was a webcomic, and then at the beginning of this year, I ended a long-running webcomic called Decades of Inexperience, which had been published since 2015 with a publisher called Antix Press. So being able to actually see, the first episode and then flip through all of the subsequent episodes, all the way through to the end, it's a very clear progression from, point A to point B, which is kind of remarkable to be able to see, honestly. And again, I think that's a little more difficult if you kind of just have print books. But for me, that's been something that I've definitely noticed, that I can, for better or for worse, I can definitely see the change from the beginning of that webcomic to, where it ended. And it's very striking between the two, even though the styles are relatively similar, because it's still, you could tell it's the same person drawing it, but there's some, I guess, polish or finesse that seem to have developed along the way that you yourself don't even notice, while it's, while it's coming into focus or while that's being formulated. But yeah, I absolutely have noticed that in my webcomics. And again, I just think that gauge is more visible in that format.
So, how would you classify yourself as a comic book fan? Would you say that you're someone who enjoys paper or digital or some hybrid of the two?
So yeah, from a reader standpoint, I think digital books are great, because especially, not that we've been able to in the last year or so, but when you travel or, you're on the go, you just need a tablet and you can bring 100 books with you. Whereas with the print, you would need a huge duffel bag and probably a friend to help you carry it. But as a collector, yeah, I'm a print guy all the way. I just love that tactile feel of books and the smell of books is, odd as that may sound. I think book lovers relate to that because there is a very specific print smell that's very gratifying. So I'm of two minds in that regard. Whereas a reader, it's great that we have the technology that we have now, and you can be able to bring a lot of books with you. But as a collector, I still tend to, I think, favor print.
Everybody has a different answer on that, which is why it's interesting. Do you feel like producing comic books is different for digital versus print, or is it more or less the same process?
Well, I think if you know what you're doing, like a lot of other cartoonists that I know, not myself specifically, but there is a difference because there are different dimensions that you're working in. A lot of the times when you're working, I suppose depending on, the website, because if you're publishing through something like Webtoons or Comixology, there's a very specific parameter that you're working in. Whereas with print, there's a very standard sort of dimension. And everybody's original art is, tends to vary, but the print size of floppies specifically is always very standard. So I think there's a lot more variance in the web comics, but there's definitely different approaches to both for certain.
So one thing I hear from lots of people frequently, being involved in the production or the editing or the artwork or the lettering, they'll say that significantly changes the way that they experience comics when they go to enjoy them.
Yeah, I definitely think that can color your experience in a lot of ways. Because it's hard when you're a creator. And again, I used to play music too, so I feel like I experience and listen to music in a very different way now as well. And I think comics, there's a very similar tone to that when you are a creator and then you're reading books. And for me, a lot of it is sometimes saying, oh, I might have done that differently, or oh, I would have done that. And the majority of it is, in my experience, the majority of it is just being in awe of a lot of the other artists, because again, I with my own art, I am constantly disappointed. But the artwork that people create, and even in the graphic novels that are coming out, even if they're super cartoony, there's just something that's so elegant and beautiful that I find in other people's artwork as opposed to my own. And sometimes that can make it difficult to interpret the entire book as a whole. And it's also one of the really great things about comics and graphic novels is it's a literary medium. And I think people want to disassociate that from literature, which in my opinion is absolutely inaccurate. Comics are a literary medium, but you absorb it in a different way. And so I think when you're a writer or an artist, or a writer and artist, you are not only taking in the story, but you're also kind of admiring all of the different components that went into creating that book. So for me, it's definitely changed the way that I read. Absolutely. And I think a lot of that is just, I guess idolatry, or maybe not idolatry, but just being amazed by what people can do, after looking at my own garbage for, the last 10 hours on the drafting table.
What inspires you?
That's a question for the ages, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, the stock answer, I think, is life. I think life it inspires everybody, but honestly, it's the human condition. That's been something that's been a driving force in the stories that I tell. And even with something like Mr. Butterchips, where it's an anthropomorphic animal, it's still about the way that people interact and the emotions that we experience and the the complex subtlety of life, which is really what we all go through every day. And I had posted something, I don't know, a week or two ago, because it's something I truly feel to my core, that stories, just like life, happen in the smaller moments. They don't happen in the Michael Bay moments. You know, and there are a lot of comic series and movies, you know, that are all about explosions and action. And that's fine. That's all well and good if that's what you want to create and that's what you want to read. I'm certainly not going to knock anybody's proclivities for what may entertain them. But for me, it's about the interaction between the characters. And that's pretty much my main driving force behind writing stories and drawing, is how those characters interact, because they have to compel you to turn the page, and you know, shootout after shootout for me personally is not going to do that. But you know, somebody going through a heartbreak, or somebody losing a loved one, or even a small victory, those are the moments that I find that draw me in, and you know, are something that hit me in a very visceral way that action doesn't. And that, of course, doesn't mean there can't be action in the story. I don't mean to sound, you know, as though I'm looking down my nose at action books. I just think, again, for me, for my writing, that's really one of the overarching goals, is to get that, to nail that interaction between characters and make sure all the characters are different. Because if you have, and I see this a lot with people who are beginning, all of their characters are basically the same characters. And the only reason there are different characters is so the one main character isn't talking to themselves the whole time. And so I try to tell people, you know, everybody has very specific personalities. They have specific traits. They have specific quirks, idiosyncrasies. And those are all important to include in storytelling.
You know, I'm super glad you brought that up. So when you're doing storytelling, how do you differentiate one character from another?
For me, it's in artwork specifically, because I used to draw characters in my early 20s. I used to draw characters that basically all look the same height, same body shape, same everything. And I had a cartoonist named Michael Jancy who does a long-running comic strip called The Norm, and he's done a lot of work for Industrial Light and Magic. And he was a huge influence on me when I was living in the Bay Area. And he took the time to analyze one of my very first comic syndicate submissions. And that was one of the biggest things that he told me, is you have to vary how the characters look, because when you can kind of differentiate how they are physically, then you can allow those characters to tell you how they move. And so they all move differently. And those movements make them think differently. And so it all kind of stems from not just the physical traits, but all of that is wrapped together, you know, in the way that they perceive the world, and the way that they will, I don't know, you know, think about what they want to do next. If they want to go into this room or that room, or sit on a chair, or sit on an ottoman. And it all basically boils down to those small choices. It's, you know, I think it was Vonnegut who said every character should want something, even if it's a glass of water. And that's always something that stuck with me. So it's all about what those characters want. Not just, you know, materially, but, you know, out of life and out of, you know, their specific journey through the world. So it affects the way they speak, and it affects their mannerisms. And it could be pretty subtle. It doesn't have to be something, you know, like the villain has a peg leg and you know, kicks puppies, and that's how you know he's the villain. It doesn't have to be something necessarily that's you know, outlandish. But I think that's what it really comes down to, is the way the characters move and think is what's going to differentiate them from one another. Because that's also what drives conversation when those characters are talking, is the different vantage points that they have on life. Because if everybody thinks the same way, those are going to be very dull conversations and very dull comics, in my opinion. So it's really about, and that's why you have to take time to figure out your characters before you even start writing a story. It was Schultz who said, if you create well-rounded characters and you fabricate them well enough, you can put them in any scene and they'll tell you what they're going to do. And so I've always kind of tried to adhere to that. Because if you know the character backwards and forwards, their phobias, the things that make them tick, their passions, then it's very easy to put them in any scenario and let them be, essentially.
Do they ever run away from you? Just do their own thing?
Oh, they try, but I'm the one with the pen. No, I think so. And honestly, if you're creating a character, and again, you've written it to the point that it's telling you what it wants to do, if being fearful and running away, if absconding and hiding is something that character needs to do, I think you have to allow them to do it.
So you got an audience question this time, and it was pretty neat, I thought. So if you bear with me while I pull it up on Twitter, because I am totally unprepared. I'll pull it up.
You've heard me speak all this time. Being unprepared is kind of my thing.
Nice. I just got so wrapped up in what you were saying that I did not pull it up ahead of time like I normally do.
You know what? I'll accept that answer because it pleases me.
Excellent. Okay, so today's speculative question was, what parts of the creative process do you notice when you read a comic? Is there anything that stands out? What stands out for you when you read a comic?
I think it's the storytelling, and that's not, especially with comics, that's not just the writing. That's also the artwork and the pacing and the way that pages are laid out. So that's something that's always very striking to me if it's not done necessarily all that well, because I think when it's successfully done, it's something that's almost unnoticeable. You're just transported into the story, and you can allow it to just take you away. But if it's not quite done as adeptly, I think for me, that certainly takes me out of the story and is not as easy for me, because it's supposed to be sort of a, transcendent experience. You're supposed to be able to, be transported to another world. And if I'm noticing, maybe the plot holes or the way that people are trying to shove 16 panels on a page, or 500 words of dialogue on one page, I think that can definitely ruin the effect for me, because there's supposed to be that veil, and you're supposed to, be absorbed in the book, I think. So for me, that's, I don't know if any of that made sense, what I just said, but that, I think it does come down to the storytelling and whether or not it's paced well. Pacing is the big thing.
Nice. Mark Wilsey, honorable mention, said something very similar. He said the pacing of the story in relation to how many art panels are being used, including full page splash ones. It's something that's already, or he wanted to know if it's something that's already laid out in the creator's mind, or if you do more of a Marvel method thing where you sort of come up with a concept and go from there.
So that, I think the answer might be fairly different depending on who you're speaking with, because if it's somebody who's focusing more on the writing, or somebody who's focusing just on the artwork, or somebody like me who right now is both writing and drawing their own comics, I think you're going to get pretty significantly different answers. So for me, while I'm writing, yeah, I'm also envisioning how pages may look. And so when I'm starting to, sort of map out how many panels are going to be on the page, I'm seeing that in my head and thinking, okay, this one's going to be 4 pages because that's going to fit the dialogue or the action well, or this specific moment may need to be drawn out, so maybe it's across a few pages. So I'm constantly thinking about that, and will even sort of very quickly, expediently, maybe draw a thumbnail or something so I remember it if it's something that's very distinct that I don't want to forget. And I think if you are an artist, once you receive the script, you're probably, those wheels or gears are starting to turn. Or if you're just writing, I think you have an idea in mind, because you have to with the script. You're going to have an idea of how many panels are on the page, but I don't know that you're necessarily able to picture how exactly those panels are going to look. So for me, I'm thinking of the size differentials and, the way that certain characters are going to flow from one panel to another. And again, I think depending on who you're talking to and what their specific role is, you're probably going to get different answers. But for me, all of that is happening at the same time, which is why 3/4 of the time while I'm making a book, I'm absolutely insane. There's not a lot of room for rational thought when you have all of that happening simultaneously.
Makes sense. Speaking of rational thought, we're entering into the final segment of the show where I get to ask you all kinds of fun, speculative questions. Are you ready?
Oh boy, yeah, let's do this.
Sweet. Okay, so you wake up one morning and you're imbued with superpowers. What are they? What does your inner superhero look like?
Oh boy, how many can I have? Is it endless?
It's anything you want.
I wasn't quite ready for that. I've been taken aback. I think invisibility is one that I've always thought was kind of cool. But also it kind of sounds pervy, so maybe not that one. Invincibility, or at least immunity to certain things, like, bullets and knives. I think that would be pretty handy. Teleportation would be great. So maybe I'll say those two. Invincibility and teleportation. I think flight is way too much responsibility for me, so that wouldn't be one that I would want. I would be over my head if I woke up with the ability to fly.
Why?
Because I would just be way too inclined to use it in the most inopportune of times. If my wife and I were having an argument or something, I'd just, peace out. I'll be in Burma. Tell me when you've calmed down.
Nice.
No, I think things like invincibility, though, and teleportation have always been really cool to me. So I'm going to say those two. Mainly because I don't have more time to think about it.
Do you see yourself as sort of a conventional hero or an anti-hero, or maybe just someone who has superpowers and isn't especially heroic? What do you do with these abilities?
That's a good question. Well, I'm inclined to say, just because of my personality and knowing myself, that I'd be an anti-hero, because I think if I saw people being particularly cruel, especially cruelty to animals, it'd be very difficult to contain my wrath or vengeance. So I don't know that I would necessarily be able to be, like a schoolboy Superman, very principled and reasoned in their thought or quest against evil. So I'm going to go with anti-hero.
Nice. What's your costume look like? Do you have one?
Who knows? Maybe I'd be a coward in my costume.
Yes.
I'm going to say nothing spandex or skin tight because I have body issues. So maybe, I don't know, maybe something plain clothes just to throw people off.
There you go.
Or maybe like a, Texas tuxedo, and I would just go jean jacket and jeans, because then people would completely dismiss me, and that's exactly what I want them to do. I feel like these are terrible answers, but those are the answers I'm giving.
Oh no, these answers are great. I want to say that these are some of the most original answers we've gotten to these questions in a long time. So where can people find you online?
My main artist site is alexschumacherart.com. I imagine those may be in the show notes because the spelling can be difficult for people. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Both of the handles are the same, at AJ Schumacher Art. And I just started a YouTube channel literally in the last 4 days. So I've started uploading content there. I'll be doing tutorials. I have a couple up now, one on the creation of a comics page. It's sort of a 101 course, so it's very basic. And one on an introduction to inking tools. And I've also uploaded several past interviews from 2020. So I'll hopefully just be continually uploading content there. And that page is Alex Schumacher Art as well. I make things very easy, mainly because I'll be able to remember them.
Well, Alex, it has been just this absolute pleasure having you on the show and listening to you discuss your journey. Thank you for visiting my humble little podcast.
Oh, likewise. Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I truly appreciate it.
Titular Characters is a magic little egg that lives in your basement. Just kidding. It's a podcast. And it's hosted by the adorable Eva Webb. That's me. Podcast art by Lexiva. Logo design by John Rochelle. Theme song by Antonia Marquis. And original music by Mikey Flash of Speed Force Music. And that's all the people involved in our happy little production this week. Join us next time for another exciting adventure in cyberspace. Love ya.